answers to that question. This is COVID-19 Lessons and Messages for the Future. We have a joint presentation by two speakers. Our first speaker is Theo Noteboom, a professor at the Shanghai Maritime University and also at the University of Antwerp and Ghent. We also have a joint speaker, Jean-Paul Rodrigue, professor at Hofstra University. We will now meet with them via video now.
Good day, everybody. My name is Theo Noteboom. I work for Shanghai Maritime University. It's a great pleasure to be presenting at this Busan International Port Conference, the 8th conference already. This will be a joint presentation with my colleague.
Hi, my name is Jean-Paul Rodrigue. I'm a professor at Hofstra University in New York.
Yes, and we will be talking about the impacts of COVID-19 on logistics, shipping, and ports, singularity or new normal.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at this, when we look at a crisis, we have to underline that a crisis sometimes does not create anything new. It simply exposes the vulnerability of a system. And right now, this is what we are contemplating is the global maritime shipping system and the port system and supply chain can be subject to an whole array of vulnerabilities, such as, of course, a rebalancing of supply chains in terms of decisions, in terms of where supply, demand, in terms of consumption. We saw a lot of supply chains being exposed to stresses. We see their reliances, or resilience also would be a better term, to a series of propagation and backpropagation mechanism. And we are start to looking at what is the fine line between what we can call abundance. What is abundant is now a little bit more scarce, and once you be scarce is a little bit more abundant. And therefore we are experiencing a lot of repricing within supply chain. And the question that Theo and I will try to address a little bit is to what extent we are dealing with a singular event, something which is unusual and which is going to go away, or is it something which is going to last for a while, which is going to create some kind of a new normal. When we look at supply chain, we look at a series of propagation and backpropagation mechanism. They are subject to a series of shocks, which could involve raw materials, could involve parts, could involve the workforce, and could also be subject to demand shocks. And when there is I would say, a crisis, it is usually taking place over one element of the supply chain, over one specific aspect. For instance, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was more of a demand shock, where a series of impacts took place and then it started to propagate. Right now, the pandemic has involved shocks over every single aspect of supply chains, and it has forced their adaptation. So that's a part of the complexity of the situation. To look at the chart that maybe many of you have seen over and over again, but it is worth considering that the current pandemic is taking place in a series of stages. And we are arguing here that essentially at this point we have four major waves of the COVID-19 pandemic over supply chains and maritime shipping. The first wave, which essentially took place in China, was a supply shock. And then as the pandemic took place around the world, we saw gigantic demand shocks with lockdowns. And as time moved on, we saw a series of measures to adapt to this, and eventually the supply chains start to, I would say, improve, and I would say the shocks start to recede. And now we are entering, you could say, a very uneasy phase of the pandemic, which can be called divergence. By this, we mean that you start to have a series of different effects across supply chains, which varies across countries and regions. And it is becoming very, very difficult to understand the full impact of the pandemic because some areas are doing better than others. And essentially this chart represents the series of shocks that took place, the supply, the demand, and also Theo can mention a little bit more about this.
Yes. So if you look at the first few shocks, the waves, that was a supply shock followed by demand shock. Then until July of this year, we saw basically a kind of adaptation wave characterized by dual propagation, in the sense that the supply was adapting to the demand and vice versa to some extent. So a lot of rebalancing taking place. And this created also a kind of new situation combined with an overall decline in economic activity and income. At the moment, we are mainly looking at the back propagation mechanism working. We see, as Jean-Paul already mentioned, quite a different situation in different parts of the world when it comes to COVID-19. But at the same time, we see also that most of the parts or regions in the world are seeing an enormous bounce back in terms of demand, partly also because of the restocking that is taking place. We'll be talking about that also a bit later. For the somewhat medium term, it's going to be very interesting to see to what extent consumption patterns will be mainly driven by material products, or will be shifting more and more to the material things like entertainment, travel, and these kind of things we had to miss so long during the lockdown situations.
Okay, so when we look at these shocks, is there a way to anticipate or try to evaluate what is their overall impact on the demand and the supply? And that's, and there's a fair amount of economic theory behind this. So when you have a shock, you start to have a differential impact by product category, ranging from basic goods all the way down to luxury goods. And usually these are the durable goods that are most impacted by shocks. And so we're going to try to see what's happening here by product, and that tend to explain a lot of the situation in ports and supply chains around the world. And all of this usually takes place along a sequence. For instance, when the financial crisis took place, it was the future indexes that were the first visible in terms of decline, for instance, of rates, of course, of market indexes. And obviously, when this happened, the manufacturing system immediately started to respond by changing their prospects, by changing their production, by changing the supply. And of course, it varies by sector. And eventually, obviously, you see an impact on container volumes, which last is, again, is going to be observed in international trade figures. So to put this into perspective, you can have a look at the United States, where those are jobless figures in April, and you see remarkable differences by sectors. You see most of the sectors that were impacted were the sector which are the most based upon human interaction, direct contact with people, such as, of course, the retail, the healthcare sector, and obviously the hotel sector. Water sector, which were linked more and more with physical goods, most of the time tended to be less impacted. So already you observe, as of April of this year, very interesting differences in the impact. And if you look in a wider picture since let's say the financial crisis, we plot here a series of index, such as the PMI, which is the Purchasing Managers Index, the price of oil. And you start to see when you have the financial crisis, you got an immediate readjustment of the index, also in terms of a sequence, and it took many years for the economy to recover, at least 2 or 3 years for the index to come back to pre-crisis level. And of course, all of this was, I would say, the consequences of an internal shock. That is, it was the financial sector that was vulnerable, and it created eventually consequences that multiplied. Obviously, with COVID-19, we're dealing with a completely different situation. The shock is not internal to the industry. The shock is external. And when we look at the impact on a series of index, it differs quite remarkably. What I mean by this is everything was impacted at the same time, a very big setback. But over the last few months, couple of months particularly, we saw a very fast and I would say impressive bounce back across a series of economic sector. And in some ways, as far as the indicators are concerned, many of them are back to pre-pandemic level. And that's, I would say, very impressive. In some cases, actually, much higher than pre-pandemic level.
Yes, and obviously there is also a huge impact on transport networks and the cargo routing, and also, of course, on ports. We will discuss some of these impacts in more detail later on, but just a kind of overview what we have seen so far. Obviously, a reduction and a reconfiguration of transport supply. One of the most visible outcomes for ports has been the blank sailings, obviously. We have also seen quite some changes taking place in modal split, whereby different transportation modes have been challenged by different aspects and have also demonstrated different growth rates. For example, if you start comparing international shipping to long-distance rail from Asia to Europe or across the North American continent, and you also compare that to air freight, you will see that they have been subjected to different dynamics. Particularly long-distance rail and air freight has been doing quite well, has been performing very strongly during the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, at a more local level, we have seen major disruptions taking place in inland logistics and transportation, partly as a result of the closure of borders, national borders, which has made it more difficult for truckers, for example, to cross the border. And also within the ports, we have seen some impacts because of all the procedures that were imposed and also the lack of dock workers in some ports around the world. What's also typical during a crisis is that we see some cargo being rerouted to other routes. One of the examples we have seen in 2009 and also in early 2020 was the fact that some ships, container ships, started to route the Cape route, use the Cape route instead of the Suez route. And obviously port choice is also impacted, and there is a very interesting kind of dynamic taking place when you have a crisis. What do? Do you concentrate your volumes in the big hubs you control or you use, or do you also spread the volumes over smaller secondary ports? And there have been different outcomes also in different parts of the world. And last but not least, we have, of course, seen a huge increase in e-commerce flows. This was already growing in the past, obviously, but we have seen a huge stepwise increase in recent months, which basically also created new challenges for the organization of distribution networks at a more regional but also international level. Next one, please. Here are some examples of these impacts. This is based on the Port Economic Impact Barometer developed by International Association of Ports and Harbors and the World Port Sustainability Program. And it gives you an idea of what ports have been reporting in terms of, for example, in this case, the number of vessel calls. And what you see is that when you look at the different markets, that obviously the passenger market has been most affected, particularly because of the fact that the cruise business stopped all activities for a number of months. If you look at container business, you can see that up to 40% of the ports were reporting drops in vessel calls of more than 5%. But you see that there's still quite a number of ports that report that there have been no major changes compared to, let's say, usual situations. So obviously we had blank sailings, we have had impacts there, but not all ports were equally impacted. Next. This is an overall view on the global container vessel calls per week. And here you see basically two important facts or evolutions. The first one was in the early part of the year, in February, where you see an enormous change compared to 2009. And this was because of the fact that we had a prolonged Chinese New Year period. Factories were closed in China, and therefore you see huge impact on the announced blank sailings. And later on, only in April, May, you can see that also, again, we see a huge drop in the number of vessel calls, mainly because of the fact that these blank sailings started to have huge impact on ports around the world.
Also, when we observe a trans-Pacific traffic between with the United States, particularly, we saw something which Theo has already noticed, a remarkable effect. Usually what happened during the financial crisis is, of course, maritime shipping companies saw a very steep decline in container volume, and they had very little pricing power. And the outcome of that was a substantial decline in rates. And what is happening during COVID-19 is the exact opposite. Shipping lines are using capacity management to control rates, and the exact opposite situation happened. As you can notice here, trans-Pacific rates between Asia and the United States have increased quite substantially since the beginning of the pandemic, which created quite interesting and complex situation for non-American ports. In the fact that we saw larger ships coming about, obviously a variation in blank sailings, and difficulties in terminal management because of the compression of the operation. And paradoxically, as some volumes were dropping, you saw more congestion at ports taking place.
Yes. Let's go into the freight rates issue a bit further. This is a representation of the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, the comprehensive one. Shanghai Containerized Freight Index looks basically at the rate evolution in terms of export out of China. And what you can see is that we saw two remarkable things happening. First of all, during the first 20 weeks or so of this year, the pandemic did not have any impact on the freight rate level. So the freight rates did not decline, did not erode during that time, which in itself was already quite remarkable. And then you see the yellow line going up after early May, and this is really the peak in demand that is building up. You see that in May, shipping lines were still idling about a little bit less than 12% of their fleet capacity. At this moment, so in October, it's about 1.8%, which basically means in practice that all available vessels are being used. So it's a peak in demand that is now clearly observable, and this has led to an enormous increase in the freight rates, and both on the Trans-Pacific, the Europe Far East, and also on some secondary trade routes, we see freight rate records being broken. And this obviously has contributed in a very positive way to the overall financial bottom line of the shipping lines. In sharp contrast to what happened during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, shipping lines are now recording or reporting positive operating margins, particularly in Q2 of this year and also Q3. The figures are not available yet, but the signals and the news we get are very optimistic. So actually, this is one of the major crises we ever had, and the overall financial situation for the shipping line is much better than in the past couple of years. Again, in the financial crisis year 2009, this was not the case. We saw negative operating margins of up to almost minus 20% for the industry as a whole. And I think there are a few reasons why we see this difference. First of all, there is, of course, the internal shock versus external shock element that Jean-Paul was referring to. But secondly, we have to take into account that the market looks quite different today compared to 2009. In 2009, the top 10 shipping lines controlled about 71% of the global container fleet capacity. Today, that's more than 91%. On top of that, some people might recall that in late 2008, the European Union outlawed liner conferences. And liner conferences were trade agreements between shipping lines focusing on price fixing and also capacity management. Joint price fixing and joint capacity management. Now you can imagine if you outlaw such a mechanism just before the start of the financial crisis, you basically leave it up to the shipping lines individually to solve the problem. So that led to a lot of irrational behavior and a kind of own strategy to combat the crisis. Today it's different. We have no liner conferences anymore, obviously, but we have alliances, and these alliances have had a bigger and bigger impact on capacity management on the east-west trade routes. On top of that, the European Union in late 2019 decided to extend the so-called block exemption regulation, or BER, which means that for the next 4 years, shipping lines will be able to continue working together in alliance formations despite the antitrust rules in Europe. So this gave an additional element to be prepared for COVID-19 crisis. let's look at what happened in the ports. What we have done is we basically compare the growth in 2009 to the growth in the first half of 2020, TU growth of the different ports. And we start with Europe, at the top 15 container ports in Europe. And as you can see in the circle, we have some ports which seem to be very vulnerable to crisis because they saw huge drops in demand in 2009 and again for the first half of 2020. These are ports such as Barcelona, Hamburg, Genova, and Le Havre. And these ports have in common that they all serve primarily national hinterlands, that they have a strong orientation towards consumer products, mainly coming from Asia, and that they also are in the transshipment business to some extent, but facing stiff competition from neighboring ports that are also handling these kind of transshipment flows. If you look on the positive side, you see, can you go back? Yeah. If you look at the positive side for Europe, then you see only one port that has been able to have stable results, meaning no traffic decline, and that's Antwerp. And this is mainly because Antwerp is specialized in commodities, in basic goods, and they have been less impacted by the crisis, and also because of the strategy of MSC to further use Antwerp as its North European hub. Next one. If you look at the Americas, we here list the top 10 container ports in North America, as well as the top 10 container ports in South America and Central America. And what you can see is that some ports have been rather unaffected by COVID-19, such as Cartagena, but also the Panamanian ports of Balboa and Colón, while other ports have seen huge impact. Look, for example, at LA, look, for example, at Seattle, Tacoma, both in 2009, but also again now, they have been impacted significantly. When we turn to Asia, then there is interesting kind of observation is that many ports in Asia are on the diagonal line, meaning that the impact of 2009 on their traffic flows was similar to what happened in the first half of 2020. There are a few exceptions. Some ports are doing not so good at all, like the port of Dalian, but also some other ports are doing quite well today compared to 2009, such as the port of Singapore and the hub port of Busan.
When we try to extract some kind of regional differences between groups of ports, we realize, and that's something which we found quite shocking, you could say, that there is actually no correlation between what happened during the financial crisis and what happened during COVID-19 in terms of its impact on ports. That is, we saw a remarkable differences. There was no predictability. And that it makes us wonder, is there a regional effect? And it seems to be that some regions of the world, particularly in the case of Europe, seems to have fared worse than other parts of the world, such as Central and North America and Asia to some extent. And we start to wonder, okay, what are the determining factor behind the variation in port performance? And at this point, what we tend to discover, it is related to their cargo composition and the related supply chains. That overall, what we seem to notice is that the ports that have been the most deeply impacted tend to be demand-oriented port linked with retail and commercial supply chains, which obviously when you have lockdowns tend to be dramatically impacted, as opposed to port which has, let's say, a more diverse and you could say a manufacturing composition tend to be less impacted. So it is to some extent the observation that we have noticed at the regional level during the pandemic so far. Obviously this is under development, but it seems to be, I would say, quite interesting. And just to mention that, and when we look at the US, the East Coast and West Coast, using the two most important representative ports, Los Angeles and of course Long Beach, you notice that, okay, the impact of COVID-19 was quite remarkable. It is something actually that was similar to when the financial crisis took place. We seem to notice similar drops. But what is remarkable is relatively on a very short notice, over a matter of a few months, 4 or 5 months, you could say, a remarkable bounce back. And right now, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of New York are reporting absolute record traffic. There's never handled so much traffic in their history. So it tells you that the prognostics are relatively good in terms of the recovery from the pandemic. Again, the risk is, are we going to get a fast recovery and then a bounce back to the previous situation? Or are the external shocks of the pandemic are going to be internalized within the economy as you start to have defaults, as you start to have lingering unemployment, and then you're going to have an internal effect that could now involve a future depressing port traffic. But at this point, it is simply in the early stages. We are right now experiencing a bounce back, which is maybe restocking taking place. The Christmas season in North America is coming. That is a peak retail season. So maybe all of this is taking place, and maybe when this is over, we might see, I would say, different outcomes.
A few things that are also relevant to look into relate to, for example, hinterland transportation. This is again based on the Port Economic Impact Barometer of IPH and World Port Sustainability Program. And here it's quite interesting to observe that in April, week 15, we had a lot of ports reporting delays in hinterland transportation, be it trucking, rail or barge services. And you can see that by week 41, that's mid-October, only few ports are still reporting problems that are COVID-19 related. It doesn't mean that congestion is not there anymore. As already mentioned by Jean-Paul, one of the outcomes of the huge peak in demand along the west coast in the US is that now LA, Long Beach are facing huge queues of trucks waiting at the terminals to pick up the containers. So there is congestion taking place, but this is not, let's say, directly created by the fact of the measures linked to COVID-19. Next one. And then when we talk about staff availability, we also see a better situation than before, so the situation is improving. In the early days of the crisis, we saw a lot of ports reporting problems in terms of availability of dock workers, availability of port authority staff, and so on. And you can see that it has not gone away, but now we are at levels of between 5 and 10% of the ports complaining about the fact that they have some shortages in terms of port-related workers. So also there, we had the initial shock created by all those measures, the lockdowns and the new rules such as social distancing that had an impact on availability of workers. But now, since we are better in managing these new rules and regulations, and also better in coping with the new normal in terms of working conditions, most ports are indeed not facing any shortages anymore.
So what's going to happen? What's ongoing? And what are, you could say, our concern regarding this? Because as we have observed, as Theo has shown, the industry has been quite nimble and effective at absorbing these effects. We are currently experiencing, I would say, an impressive recovery. But are we going to see some kind of an economic reset among also supply chain? And that's an issue. For instance, as we know, we look at the workforce. Many organizations are now reconsidering their workforce structure with the use of telework. That has been in North America and Europe in particular, and I'm going to assume as well in Asia, a very significant change in terms of how people work. And it might give a corporation incentive to question what is their actual labor need when you do, I would say, furloughs, and when you get rid of some of your workers and you say it's temporary, it could become permanent. And we have noticed that economies which are linked along the service sector are the most vulnerable, paradoxically. And that's most advanced economies around the world. The service sector has been particularly vulnerable to the pandemic, because obviously the service sector is an interaction-based activity, a human interaction-based of sector, which involves immediate impacts. And again, we wonder, a lot of this discretionary demand has vanished. The retail sector, the travel sector has seen, I would say, 95% drop In the United States, we're still down 50% down in terms of air traffic, in terms of all this demand there. The hotel industry, the same story. A lot of discretionary demand has vanished, and you wonder to what extent this demand is going to come back. We're going to see that over the coming months. We also think the risk, a lot of financial firms and a lot of manufacturing and retail activities in the United States, for instance, have now run out of savings, have now starting to default on their debt. And this can create cascading effects among financial sector. That we could now have the beginning of a financial crisis, similar to what took place in 2008, 2009, because of that, because of those measures. So we're going to wonder about that. And obviously, it was a small and medium-sized business that tend to be the most vulnerable. So again, it has very important impact on the workforce and the composition of the economy. And substitution has been the rule of the game. Theo has already mentioned the impact of e-commerce has been dramatic. I have figures in the United States that this year alone, Amazon has increased its warehousing footprint by 40%. That's mind-boggling in terms of how big the e-commerce has grown because of the crisis. And once it's taking place, I'll assume a lot of consumers are not going to go back to you could say, physical shopping. And that could have a cascading effect a further cascading effect on the retail sector, which is having serious problems in terms of store closures. And all of this, everywhere you can think of, in ports and supply chain, it's going to push towards automation. So that's a very, very big issue. There's a very big reset currently taking place. It's going to have significant consequences. And to some extent, that brings us a series of questions. Again, is it a single event which is going to go away and then we're going to go back to normal? Or are we experiencing a form of new normal? Are we having very big differences between a pre-COVID and a post-COVID setting? And when you look at economic integration process, we're going to see, are we going to go back to protectionism? To what extent China is going to lose a lot of trust regarding its trading partner, because that's a situation which was already taking place with the United States before the pandemic. In terms of production, obviously, we're going to see a lot of automation push and a lot of reshoring taking place. And that could actually experience some kind of decline in global transportation flows. Now we have a bounce back, but overall, we're going to see over the next year or so, when all of this is said is gone, an actual decline. And to what extent all of this is going to create inflationary trend or deflationary trend, we're not too sure. Most likely deflationary trend, and a very big repricing concerning commodity prices. And that brings, of course, a lot of questions to Korea and a port such as Busan. Maybe Theo, you can mention what might be the prognostic regarding
yes,
that.
One of the challenges, I think, will be on how Busan can react and can deal with the risk of seeing export-oriented manufacturing activities moving away from China to other parts of the world, including, for example, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, also India, but also even countries in Africa, where, for example, Kenya and other East African countries are very active in trying to lure some investors in for these kind of production activities. And on top of that, there is also a big, I would say, interesting growth perspective, in the sense that since reshoring, nearshoring activity probably is going to increase in the future, there might be a relative increase in the intra-regional importance of intra-regional trade. So intra-Asian container flows are already by far the biggest flows in the world, and I suspect that the dominance of intra-regional container flows will increase further in the future, which then, of course, poses a lot of interesting opportunities for big trading hubs such as the Port of Busan. So I think we're at the end of this presentation. Jean-Paul and I, we both thank you for listening to us, and we also refer you to one of our projects we're working jointly on together with our colleague Thanos Palis in the framework of a book on port economics management and policy.
Yes, thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure for us to give you this perspective on a very, I would say, dramatic event which is unfolding, but which also allows us to learn a lot about the industry. It's very interesting what's happening in terms of all the stakeholders are behaving.